welcome back. So this is going to be a panel about Bergson and theories of evolution that will be moderated by Charles. And we will first listen to Benjamin Woodard, that is here. So Benjamin is an independent scholar based in Germany, and his work focuses on the relationship between naturalism and idealism in the 19th century. So he's currently preparing a monograph on the role of idealism in the life sciences. And his book, Schelling's Naturalism, was published in 2019 by Edinburgh University. And today, he's going to talk about Bergson's biophilosophy.
And I guess the rules are 20-minute talk, 20-minute discussion, but Mathilde prefers that the questions come at the end. I think if there's a quick question that someone has to ask after the talk, they can, but otherwise we put the questions after the two talks, right?
Yes.
So go ahead, Ben.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you, Mathilde, for the organization and also for the talk. It makes my talk a bit easier in terms of some of the things I'm discussing. So that's also a bonus for me. So, okay, I'm just going to share my slides really quickly, and hopefully this makes sense. It's saying I can't share my screen.
So Mathilde has to permit it.
Yeah, sorry, I muted, but I just said that I'm going to do it.
It's coming from you, Mathilde.
I think now you should be able to do it. Just restart.
Yep, now it works. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, right. So I want to talk about Bergson as a historian and philosopher of biology, even though I know that's sort of an awkward thing to do to him. Basically want to take creative evolution as if it's a text of philosophy and history of biology, and try to see what he's doing in that text that sort of, that contributes something to the discussion of biology at the time, and also like where it puts Bergson's thoughts about biology now. And of course, I say biophilosophy because there's not this neat separation between between the historical and the philosophical, right? So they're kind of obviously co-constitutive in a certain sense. So yeah, that's what I hope to do in 20 minutes, if this is possible. So I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide, obviously, but in doing history and philosophy of biology, I've been using this kind of fourfold, which is on the left, a fourfold way of thinking different clusters of concepts about biology and about the organism specifically. So essentially this division between thinking organisms in terms of their goals or purposes, in terms of forces, right? Whether it's metaphysical forces, vital forces, or self-organization, whether it's in terms of form, so thinking development, right? Morphology, this kind of thing, or thinking in terms of function, right? That's adaptation, thinking organisms in terms of they are what they do, right? How they survive or don't. And so this is just a sort of heuristic in order to see the various clusters that Bergson discusses in Creative Evolution. And his work is quite useful history of a period that is often not well known. I mean, it is much better now, but for a long time, this sort of 50 years or so after Darwin has often been treated like a kind of dark ages by a lot of historians without much justification. for doing that. So just to say briefly, what I'll do is I'll go through each of the clusters and say what Bergson in particular highlights, but hopefully it makes some sense, at least this emphasis on goal and teleology in this period is about, having some kind of directed form of evolution, maybe not teleological, but some kind of purposefulness must be built in, against Darwin. Whether it's neo-vitalism, which we've, heard a bit about, this emphasis on, life being irreducible in a certain sense, and being maybe even metaphysically special in some way. This question of mutation and structuralism, right, in the sense of looking at development or questions of form, in terms of, how living materials give rise to different morphologies and what that in turn means. And then, of course, lastly, neo-Darwinism being this attempt to sort of use statistics on the one hand and some paleontologists on the other hand to try to show how natural selection is working, right? So, I mean, that would be the very brief kind of huge overview that Bergson does quite well overview of that. But then there's certain aspects that he highlights. So I'm just going to go in the same order, kind of clockwise, and talk about that. So to talk about this kind of emphasis on direction or on teleology or something like teleology, Bergson is quite sympathetic, I think, to E.G. Cope, who was this, at the time, well-known American neo-Lamarckian. He looks like he's having a staring contest with a fossil in this picture. But while a paleontologist, the kind of work that Bergson finds most interesting in him is this emphasis on a directedness to life, not one that is goal-oriented in a finalist sense, but that is a kind of a complexity that is based upon increasingly intense states, right? So in a sense, Cope is interested in the idea that life becomes increasingly intense, and that this is especially important to explain human thought and the difference between human thought and, the mental capacities of a similar animal. So there's a lot of this this theme, and some lines from Cope appear almost with different words in Bergson in this regard. So then in terms of the neo-vitalists, as Mathilde already mentioned this, right, that Bergson, when he talks about Driesch, this is of course his, the sea urchin research, he's, again, Bergson is skeptical of this metaphysical interpretation, but he's somewhat sympathetic in various degrees to this, epistemological or, this kind of cautionary tale, right, from vitalism, that we shouldn't let our theories get too far ahead of our experience, right? So Bergson takes that from them, but then he otherwise kind of distances himself. And then what's most interesting for me, and what I'll talk about later on, is when he mentions, when Bergson mentions the mutationists, and he mentions William Bateson and Hugo de Vries particularly, he's interested in largely the concept or the idea that there could be transformations or changes in the natural world that don't adhere to this Darwinian gradualism, right? So the fact that there could be sudden or unpredictable changes, there's a dynamic quality to this that Bergson likes. And, this picture is de Vries's famous primrose, which, he thought was a proof of this kind of mutationist theory. And I'll kind of go into what mutationism really meant later. But Bergson kind of takes up this different time scale that they suggest and uses it as sort of a weapon against the Darwinians mostly. Other than that, he doesn't really go into details about their theories so much. And then so lastly, and there's a really bad teleology joke for you. Lastly, of course, is Bergson's distrust and critique, right, of the neo-Darwinians and of Darwin himself, right? That there's this mechanistic interpretation of evolution, right? He thinks harbors a kind of finalism, right, or harbors some kind of more active agent than Darwin might, Darwin or the neo-Darwinians might want to admit. So this is just this quote, which I mean, I don't know if I need to read it, but the sort of emphasis being that, Bergson thinks that evolution does take place in this kind of minute way, in the way that the Darwinians say, but he thinks that mentality or instinct must be kind of emerge in a different sense, right? And at the same time, he thinks, right, mentality or instinct or these like psychic potentialities can't be an accident, like the Darwinians say, but it can't be only individualistic in the way that the Lamarckians seem to suggest. So this is where he's a bit different from Cope, and that Bergson wants the mental or the psychic to be sort of special in a certain sense, but not individualistic, right? He wants it to be collective. Okay, and so where this gets a bit more complicated is the period immediately following creative evolution, or creative evolution comes out at the sort of beginning of this change, is it this fourfold distinction, right, between neo-Lamarckian, neo-vitalist, mutationist, and neo-Darwinian gets kind of crunched, at least as the histories tell it, and this obviously is a simplification, into this kind of two-way split between biometricians, right, who were the more statistically minded Darwinians, and the mutationists and those related to them who rediscovered and were pushing for basically early genetics, right? So pushing for this emphasis on smaller changes leading to these bigger changes, which then natural selection might operate on, right? So, and then of course, following this is the sort of famous modern synthesis that we're still living with in some form today, right, where Mendel and Darwin are combined. But what's interesting about Bergson is that he kind of is more sympathetic to the mutationist side, or the proto-genetic side of things, which was kind of atypical for the time when he's writing this history to some regard. But again, he sort of stops his interest in the mutationists there, and I think partially because they were pushing for a strong causal picture of biology, which he probably wouldn't have made so much sense with his relationship to materiality, but that's a sort of different, a different issue. Okay, so to explain more this split between the biometricians and the mutationists and how Bergson kind of touches on it and relates to it. And this is borrowing, there's this essay by Stoltzfus and Cable where they kind of try to rehabilitate the mutationists a bit, right? That they weren't just kind of aggressive anti-Darwinian, that they were actually trying to complicate the picture in a certain sense. And what the essay points out, and what I think is really important, and Bergson falls victim to this a little bit, is that there's often this opposition between mutations and natural selection, right? So there's a sense that the mutationists thought that mutation was the real engine of change, and comparable to natural selection. And Bergson kind of uses them as a weapon in this way, kind of against the neo-Darwinians. But it's in fact more fair to say, and if you actually go back and read people like Hugo de Vries or Punnett, like I did, if you want to read hundreds and hundreds of pages about butterflies, which is, actually can be quite nice. There's a sense that they're trying to add on or complicate the Darwinian picture, in that mutations are proof that there are mechanisms other than natural selection at work, not to replace it, right? That there's environmental changes, right, in terms of the coloration of butterflies, or, there's chemical, changes which suggest there must be something like genetics happening. And maybe under genetics, there's even something more fine-grained, right? This is really clear in the work of people like Punnett or Bateson later on. And I think part of the reason why Bergson wouldn't be sympathetic to that picture also, and again, he's not atypical in this sense, is that he sees this notion of insensible variations, for instance, right, in Darwin as a kind of huge flaw in Darwin's thinking, that Darwin is saying there's these things I don't know what they are, whether he's talking about genetics or just the work of time, which are insensible. And it's quite interesting, just as a kind of an aside, that in the French version of The Origin of Species, the term insensible is actually used much more often than it is in the English one. So there's places where Darwin will talk about graduated change, and that will be translated as insensible change, for instance. And those exact passages are some of the ones that Bergson refers to. So there's even this added complication, right? Why Bergson would not be sympathetic to this particular form of the mutationist and of what they were suggesting. Okay, so then, right, the point is, okay, what is Bergson's theory of life, or like what is it that he offers in the book that isn't just a critique or a survey? And so I'm at the risk of angering a lot of Bergsonians. I want to say that Bergson is actually a type of functionalist, but a very weird one. And I think this makes sense in terms of the legacies that he's using in creative evolution, and that he borrows, for instance, from both Cuvier and Lamarck, but in very particular ways. And this goes back to his sympathy for Cope. So, for instance, I think Bergson borrows a functionalism, the sense that things are what they do, but he makes it about these sort of intensive capacities of a thing. So, in a sense, Bergson has a kind of intense, or we could even say immaterial, or maybe spiritual, with all the caveats, with that word, functionalist, right? So that he's interested in the sort of intensive states, or the kind of non-material things that organisms can do. So in that sense, and this also implies a kind of plurality of lineages, right? Or a sense that there are many types of living things, whose capacities are not reduced, aren't necessarily about their shared ancestry, it's about their difference and divergence, right? So this is also a kind of idea in Cuvier, this kind of radical plurality. But from Lamarck, of course, he's obviously very invested in this notion of acquired inheritance, or the fact that there's a kind of psychological, or in terms of habits and memories, right? There's this kind of responsiveness to the outside world, which kind of adds depth to this otherwise kind of surface level functionalism. Right? So the intensity of Bergson's functionalism has this kind of weight of memory and this kind of psycho-Lamarckian aspect to it, right? But he kind of uses these disparate ideas to kind of push against one another, I think.
Ben?
Yeah?
2 minutes?
Yeah, okay. And I think a passage that sums this up really well is this line, which I'll read from Creative Evolution, where he says, "The consciousness of a living being is inseparable from its brain, in the sense in which a sharp knife is inseparable from its edge. The brain is the sharp edge by which consciousness cuts into the compact tissue of events, but the brain is no more coextensive with consciousness than the edge is with the knife." So this is what I mean by sort of this kind of immaterial functionalism, right? I think there's something of that spirit there. And so I think it's also evident in some of the influences of Bergson, people who are sympathetic to paleontology or anthropology or biology, And that, for instance, Huxley uses Bergson, despite his, famous critique of him, as Emily Herring has shown, he is actually kind of motivated and propulsed by Bergson. Teilhard de Chardin, right, kind of sees this kind of complexing, intensive role of consciousness as even being expandable to a cosmological level, right? It's kind of justifying the sort of roles and responsibilities of the human, right? Even though he's kind of using an evolutionary picture to do this. And then on the far right, of course, Laurent doing a kind of paleoanthropological version of this, right? That we are sort of intensive functionalists in the sense that our actions and gestures of our work and our culture are special to the human because they can be extracted, right, and passed along, right? So this is then the kind of Lamarckian side of this. So then as my sort of last slide, I think it would be tempting to put Bergson in this tradition of the emergentists and this kind of self-organization kind of literature, but I think he actually belongs more in a more recent trend, in the sense of people who are looking for the minimal unit, in some sense, of consciousness. So rather than looking at how biology can make consciousness happen, it's sort of looking at biology and life as something that kind of, co-evolves or kind of moves alongside consciousness in all its plural forms. And these are all books from the last 10 years. The first two are from even more recent. And then the middle one, LeBlanc and Ginsberg, actually discuss Bergson. They're a bit critical, but they're also sympathetic, right, to this idea, right, this notion that consciousness can involve in these tiny little steps that we can kind of functionally describe, but that the sort of limits and the capacities of them are not functionally explicable, that they're always going to give way to either the possibility of a new historical picture in terms of the capacities of thinking, as well as a deep past, which we're going to be constantly rewriting because we are conscious beings. So this is where I think Bergson can kind of go as a philosopher and historian of biology in the contemporary moment. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben Woodard. I am very interested, but I'll wait till later. I would give the floor, well, okay, so I see, but Antoine, you have to take your hand down. You've got a structurally built-in hand up. We need novelty. So when you raise your hand, it will be new again. So Bruno Rattes, a quick question.
So thank you, Benjamin. So I have a question regarding the link that you made between Bergson and Lamarckism, because Bergson, he rejects completely the use inheritance hypothesis, and he sides with Weismann, which is strongly also he was against the use inheritance. How would you respond to that objection? That's it.
Well, I would say that he's somewhat sympathetic to Weismann from what I remember, but I feel like he's sympathetic in spirit, at least to the psycho-Lamarckians. So as far as I remember, he says it's not really answerable whether physical traits or morphological traits are evolved or inherited in a certain way. So he rejects the materialist side of it. But as far as, from what I know, when he talks about the sense that there's, at least in each individual lineage, there's a sort of memory which makes the sort of intensification process of consciousness possible. So that there's a sort of inheritance of memory in the sense that it adds to the sort of active capacity of that lineage. So this is what I think he takes from psycho-Lamarckianism. He kind of strips it down a bit. But to me, that's what I see him using, especially in these passages where he talks about like all of the species marching, like an army towards, it's very much this, that they're sort of an intensive psychic living history. So that's what I would say. I would say he's sympathetic to this kind of stripped down version of the Cope picture, but yeah, he's not sympathetic to Lamarck's materialism, for instance.
So let's thank Ben Woodard, and I give the floor to Joël Dolbeault. will speak on Sewell Wright. Where's the title? Sewell Wright, leading geneticist, reader of Bergson, and almost Bergson.
Naomi, it's okay.
Okay, sorry. Yes, I wanted to introduce you, Joël, but I muted my. Okay, so Joël studied the history of philosophy and philosophy of science at the University of Paris of the Sorbonne, and he obtained a PhD at the University of Lille with Frédéric Worms as the thesis director. So his research aims to confront the main metaphysical ideas of Bergson with the contemporary ideas in philosophy and science. He's particularly interested in the Bergsonian theory of matter, and he has published several articles on this subject. And today he'll talk about Sewell Wright and the Bergsonism.
Thank you, Mathilde, for this presentation and for organizing this webinar. I have a PowerPoint. So I need the screen function. It's, can you see my, it's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice title.
Thanks. So my title, as this title indicates, the aim of my presentation is to show that the biologist Sewell Wright defended philosophical ideas about life very close to those of Bergson. However, as I will attempt to explain, Wright does not completely agree with Bergson. And what is interesting is that an important difference between them is about the issue of vitalism. My plan will be as follows. Part 1 on Wright and his relation to Bergson. Part 2 on Wright's Bergsonian ideas. And part 3 on the difference between Bergson and Wright about vitalism. Who is Sewell Wright and what is his relation to Bergson? Sewell Wright is an American biologist specializing in genetics. He is considered as one of the founders of population genetics, along with Fisher and Aldan. Population genetics is the application of Mendelian genetics at the level of population. It is one of the pillars of the synthetic theory of evolution, also called neo-Darwinism. Wright introduced several statistical methods in population genetics. He is also known for having developed the theory of genetic drift, which aims to explain how a random event can vary the frequency of certain alleles in a population, and thus play a role in the evolution of this population. In addition to his scientific work, Wright developed a philosophical conception of life, and this conception is explained mainly in 3 articles. In 1953, Gene and Organism, in 1964, Biology and the Philosophy of Science, and in 1975, Panpsychism and Science. In all these articles, Wright said that to have been greatly impressed by Bergson's creative evolution, translated in English in 1911. Impressed in particular by Bergson's opposition to the deterministic point of view. However, Wright adds that he must have read other authors before abandoning determinism, especially the mathematician Carl Pearson and the biochemist Benjamin Moore. In fact, influenced by Bergson, Wright first thought that determinism did not seem to apply to life, but for Wright, this implied that determinism should not apply to inert matter either. And it is this idea that he found in Pearson and Moore. Now, Wright does not discuss Bergson in detail. It is therefore difficult to know what he thinks of this or that precise idea of Bergson. we can only analyze the ideas he defends and see how far they echo those of Bergson. This is what I do in the next two parts. So second part, writes Bergsonian ideas. In his philosophy articles, Wright supports two distinctly Bergsonian ideas. First, life is psychic in nature. It is something analogous to our stream of consciousness. And second, life has a creative dimension. For the first idea, life is psychic in nature, I quote Wright, the prevailing trend among biologists, however, has been away from vitalism and toward increasing materialism and mechanism in interpreting physiology and behavior. The limit of this trend would seem to be complete materialism, the complete denial of mind as a category of existence. This, however, is contrary to the obvious facts of immediate experience. Our stream of consciousness is all that is experienced directly. Mind, even though denied any role in the course of events, must be retained as a category of existence, at least as an observer. And in the same article, the only satisfactory solution of these dilemmas would seem to be that mind is universal, present not only in all organisms and in their cells, but in molecules, atoms, and elementary particles. I quote Bergson now, in parallel. In reality, life is of the psychological order, and it is of the essence of the psychological to enfold a confused plurality of interpenetrating terms. And before in the book, life, that is to say, consciousness launched into matter. Consciousness appears as the motive principle of evolution. On the basis of these quotations, I want to underline the fact that for Wright as for Bergson, life really has a psychic dimension, irreducible to its physical dimension. However, for Wright and Bergson, life is only analogous to our own consciousness, because this one is only one possible form of the psychic. For Bergson in particular, our consciousness is strongly oriented towards intelligence, which is only one of the forms of life. This is why our consciousness gives us only a very imperfect idea of life. So I agree with what Mathilde said about the non-spiritual nature of life in creative evolution, but this non-transcendent nature does not mean that for Bergson life is not psychological in nature. It is psychological or psychic, but even if it is not transcendent. In detail, Wright and Bergson do not agree on how to think of the irreducibility of the psychic to the physical, and I will come back to it, but at least they share this conclusion. I come back to my second quotation of Wright, saying that mind is present, mind is universal, present not only in all organisms and in their cells, but in molecules, atoms, and elementary particles. As we can see, Wright defends a form of panpsychism. According to him, the fact that life originates in inert matter suggests that inert matter already has something psychic. The second Bergsonian idea is that life has a creative dimension. This idea corresponds to an opposition to determinism, which asserts that the totality of the future is predetermined by laws. For Wright as for Bergson, the future of life is not predetermined by laws, nor by anything else. I quote Wright, subjectively, mind seems to involve the continual exercise of choice, always, of course, within a limited range of possibilities. How is this freedom to be reconciled with the apparent determinism of natural science? Part of the answer is, already noted, that the laws of nature are ultimately statistical and no more preclude choice on the part of individual components than do statistical laws of human behavior. And the second quotation, physical science thus has arrived at statistical mechanics as its ultimate form of statement, rather than deterministic equations. There seems to be nothing in physics that prevents the view that its particles are literal creatures acting essentially like the larger familiar organisms. In fact, like Bergson, Wright thinks that the psychic does have a causal role. More than that, he thinks that every action in nature is a kind of choice, that is, a psychic act, including the actions of elementary particles. However, according to Wright, when physical systems are similar, their actions tend to resemble each other, that is, to form statistical laws. In this sense, the laws of nature, for Wright, are only statistical regularities. They are an effect of the choices made by organisms and not a fundamental reality, which would determine these choices, as it is the case, in fact, for determinism. Of course, for Wright, some organisms have more singularity than others, in particular human beings. And for these organisms, behaviors are, of course, less regular. It's more difficult to find statistical regularities. Finally, let us note that for Wright and for Bergson, philosophy and science have different tasks. The goal of philosophy is to reveal the essence of things, which is psychic in nature for both, whereas the goal of science is only to discover natural regularities without introducing psychological considerations, especially in biology. I quote Wright and Bergson in parallel. For Wright, I fully agree with Pearson here that science is restricted to verifiable knowledge and thus must exclude the knowledge of our streams of consciousness because it is unverifiable by anyone else. We must continue to accept a rigorous determinism as far as possible and supplement this by probability distributions where necessary, even though we interpret the determinism philosophically as the external aspect of choices throughout the hierarchy of existence. And for Bergson, now I recognize that positive science can and should proceed as if organization was like making a machine. For its object is not to show us the essence of things, but to furnish us with the best means of acting on them. And now last part on the difference between Bergson and Wright about vitalism. In this last part, I want to show that Bergson and Wright disagree on a point, and that this point concerns the question of vitalism. In the general sense of the term, vitalism corresponds to the idea that the phenomena of life are irreducible to those of inert matter. And in this sense, Bergson and Wright are vitalists. But in a more restricted sense, vitalism corresponds to the doctrine of certain thinkers, in particular Barthes and Driesch. And in chapter 1 of Creative Evolution, Bergson criticizes this doctrine. According to him, vitalist thinkers mistakenly consider that every living being has its own vital principle, and therefore that there are as many vital principles as there are individuals. In contrast, for Bergson, living beings form a certain psychic whole beyond their physical division. I quote Bergson, in this sense, each individual may be said to remain united with the totality of living beings by invisible bonds. This passage is when Bergson criticizes vitalism. This life common to all the living is not so mathematically one that it cannot allow each being to become individualized to a certain degree, but it forms a single whole nonetheless. And later, it is in virtue of the primitive impetus of the whole that the movement of the parts continues. Something of the whole, therefore, must abide in the parts. For Bergson, from the psychological point of view, living beings form a single whole, that is, a single force. And the single force is what Bergson calls the élan vital. Okay, the notion of élan vital is an image, but I think that Bergson precised that this is an image of a force or of a gritty force, he writes. However, as it evolves, this single force tends to divide and become multiple. But for Bergson, despite this multiplicity, living beings retain a certain unity at all times. And this is why he writes that they are united by invisible bounds, or that they form a single whole. Besides, for Bergson, this psychological unity of living beings is what explains convergences in evolution. Certain lineages converge because they continue to form a single whole. The Bergsonian criticism of vitalism is not found, this Bergsonian criticism of vitalism is not found in Wright, who in this sense is closer to vitalism than Bergson. For Wright, vitalism is not a good scientific theory because the goal of science is only to discover regularities. And speaking of a vital principle, has no scientific interest for Wright. But Wright is not for vitalism as a metaphysical theory of life. We could say, in fact, that he is panpsychist, but also vitalist. To conclude on this point, it should be noted that the hypothesis of a certain psychic unity of all living beings implies that the psychic and the physical are not two aspects of the same reality. In other words, that there is no isomorphy, in fact.
Joël?
Yes?
I'm not sure exactly when you started, but if you can take 2 more minutes.
Yes.
Okay.
So for Bergson, there is no isomorphy between the psychic and the physical. So you can have this hypothesis of the élan as something, as just one thing. For Wright, the psychic and the physical are two irreducible aspects of the same reality. So Wright cannot logically adopt the Bergsonian hypothesis of the élan vital. And conclusion on evolution according to Wright. In his philosophy papers, Wright talks very little about evolution. However, what he says about life in general allows us to infer some things. For Wright, the main cause of evolution is not a single impetus as for Bergson. However, for him, evolution cannot be a totally blind process because it depends on psychic and creative forces acting at the level of each organisms. So the question is Wright neo-Darwinian? I mean, does he really support the synthetic theory of evolution? Logically, I think that his position is this. Neo-Darwinism deserves to be defended, but only as a scientific approach to life. That is, an approach that deals with what is observable from the outside, but cannot claim to know the fundamental nature of life. And in fact, there are a lot of passages in which Wright explains this idea. One of this is this passage: what we are given is a tenable philosophy of science, and along with this, a desirable humility in the recognition that science is a limited venture concerned with the external and statistical aspect of events and incapable of dealing with the unique creative aspect of each individual event. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So we've got 14 minutes for questions, so let's be efficient. Maybe, Joël, if you stop sharing your screen.
Yes, I tried. Okay. Okay.
Anyone?
No.
I can ask. Yeah, Paul-Antoine.
if nobody speaks, then I can speak it. So first of all, many thanks, because I think it's the first time that I'm listening a presentation with this comparison between Wright and Bergson. I think it's the first time. And so it's a pity because it's a very interesting comparison. And well, I just will focus on one point. Thank you for the presentation. Bergson Vitalism is focused on evolution. And Élan Vital is working at the level of evolution, not at the level of the organism. That's a very important point. Organization is just what is, say, a modus vivendi. So I think, I don't know if it's a difference with Wright, because Wright tried to understand the biology at the evolutionary level. So I think the comparison can work. And so my question here, at the level of evolution, one very important point is that evolution is a creative one. So there is some kind of circular causality in evolution, and Élan Vital deals with this circular evolution causality that is also a creative one, because the cause are also effects on their own. And so the change is coming from this. It's completely explained by Bergson in the second chapter of Creative Evolution. And I think that, so that is my question. Maybe it's possible to make a comparison with Wright, because you spoke just of genetic drift, but the main topic in Wright is the shifting balance theory and adaptive landscapes. And the theory of adaptive landscape is connected with the idea that selection is not just, negative. Selection has a creative effect, because you have a lot of constraints that define what a genetic population is. And so selection is a creative effect that can lead to new forms, to new species, to new varieties. And I remember that so selection is not simply a filter. And I remember that the controversy between Fisher and Wright was precisely on this point. So my question is, can we make a comparison between the creativity of evolution in Bergson and the creativity of selection in Wright?
Thanks for the question. It's true that it's difficult to compare these two thinkers, because as you say, Bergson's focuses on evolution, while Wright essentially focuses on, in his philosophical papers, focuses on organism. He doesn't say a lot of things about evolution. Just one or two remarks here and there. So it's difficult to make the comparison, but maybe an element of, so I agree with this on this point. But to answer your question, maybe one element of answer is to say that, in fact, what Wright develops as scientific theories for him, as there is no real relation between his scientific work and his philosophical work, according to him. When he in the few passages where he philosophically speaks about evolution, he said that what I said is subjective; it's not scientific. So don't take this as a scientific idea. There is a passage in particular in a scientific paper in 1931 where he writes that I think that there is freedom in evolution. He used this term in the scientific paper. There is freedom in evolution, but it's just a subjective idea, and it has I have no I do not pretend to tell something scientific when I say that there is freedom in evolution. So I think that what is striking in Wright is the strong demarcation he makes between his scientific ideas and his philosophical ideas. For him, there is it's as if there were no connection between the two parts. So maybe you're right that maybe Bergson could say that, as he says for physicists and the integral calculation, Wright had an intuition which makes him think of a certain scientific theory, but in this theory, the intuition is no more present. There is just science and the intuition aspect of his.
Joël, you got to keep it quick if we have time for the next questions. So Tano, then Mathilde.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks for both of those talks. They're both stimulating. I have a question for Benjamin, but I think actually it's a question for both. The question is about the formulation, which I found really sort of provocative, intensive functionalism that you use, Benjamin. And I wonder how this relates to the idea in creative evolution that an organ, the structure of an organ is just a kind of expression of its formal sophistication or what it can do. So this idea of the eye being as complex as vision is intense or something like this. I wonder if that's what you meant, or if not, what you did mean by the term. And the link to Joel's paper is on convergence testifying to the unity of life. So all the eyes in all the different species are convergent in that they express the same functional tendency towards vision. So like calling back to the unity of life in all its divergent realizations. So I wonder if you're talking about the same things, or if not, and what the concept of intensive functionalism is doing in that context. So thanks. Hopefully that was coherent and not just a bunch of things in a row. You can correct me if, great, I'll stop.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think the discourse on the eye is one example of that, because I think because Bergson can't really talk about, and he doesn't want to say that there's this kind of responsiveness that is material in a sort of materialist way, right? Like, I mean, in terms of biological theories, like he doesn't want to, he's sort of against someone like, Dolbeault or any kinds of like the mechanist materialists. So I think essentially what he wants to do is separate functionalism from mechanism and from materialism. And of course, it's very hard to do, but I think biology is one place you could try to do it. And so that's what I mean, I think, by this notion of intensity, which, I think is essentially, it's the sort of potential for things like instinct and then intelligence to come out, right? Which, like he says, is kind of attached or faceted to living things. But, it's a driving force in a certain way, but it's also, it has some degree of autonomy, I think, right? So I mean, that's the hard thing in Bergson, is to say, like, what is the real impact of intensity on materiality without invoking too much of materiality to be like, to be too much like a materialist in the sense of like, Huxley or something like this. So I think that's like the hard question, which I don't really have an answer for yet, but I think that's what Bergson is also trying to figure out himself, I think.
Mathilde.
Yeah, my questions are quite quick, but there are two others and I don't want to overstep. So I'm just leaving you, maybe letting Letizia and Izashi ask their question, and I'll deal with it.
So, okay, so the questions in the Q&R, I don't think everyone sees them. So, je lis les questions, non? Laetitia says, thank you for your clear and interesting discussion. Many questions, but I limit myself to one. In your opinion, could the term regularity come close to the phenomenological notion of invariance, allowing a philosopher like Husserl to be included in the comparison? And there is from Hisashi Fujita. Thank you, Joel. My naive question is for your comparison, Bergson and Wright, is away from, but is still in your research area. What could be the relation between vitalism and panpsychism? Is vitalism reducible to panpsychism, or are they compatible, but how?
Thanks for these questions. For the first question, in fact, in an interesting forthcoming paper, Charles, you distinguish different meanings of the vitalism, and in a sense, we can distinguish vitalism and panpsychism, of course, because in the history of vitalism, there is the idea that there is a strong difference between the phenomena of inert matter and those of living matter. So we can, historically, we can say that there is a distinction between vitalism and panpsychism, of course. But if we accept a more general sense of the term vitalism, the two things are compatible. Just one remark for Wright is panpsychist because he thinks that if there is freedom in life, there must be freedom also in inert matter. This is the very classical argument for panpsychism today in literature. And there was a first question about regularities. Regularities and
could the term regularity come close to the phenomenological notion of invariance, allowing a philosopher like Husserl to be included in the comparison?
Here, I don't understand the question. The word invariance here has biological meaning.
I'm just the messenger. I'm just reading the questions.
In Wright, I can say that in Wright, the term regularity is an epistemological term. In fact, it is the term used today to speak of the laws of nature. For some philosophers, laws of nature are just regularities. And for others, laws of nature are kind of a Platonician idea acting on the world to determine it. And for Wright, the position defined by Wright is that laws of nature are only regularities. They aren't a fundamental reality.
Okay, so it's time perfectly for me to hand over to Paul-Antoine, who's chairing the next session. Thank you, everybody.